this one of my few hairs in my eye. Okay. Hello, people. Welcome to the show. This is a kind of impromptu episode. For those of you that don't know, I generally post episodes every other Sunday, but I just wanted to speak about this subject in a spontaneous kind of way, unscripted. The subject is Louis Theroux's most recent documentary, Inside the Manosphere. It's on Netflix. I would very much recommend watching it to give a bit of context as to what I'm going to be talking about here. But I'm very interested in the subject. I found the documentary very interesting. I'm interested in the conversations surrounding the subject. So I wanted to just jump on, give my 2 pence about the subject. Most of my solo episodes, they are relatively written in advance, so I am reading off a teleprompter, but this one I'm not. So bear with me if it's a bit rusty, if I have to edit it heavily because whatever I'm talking about is just very incoherent. I have a wee bit of talking points that I've just thought of this morning as I've been thinking about it, but I'm very much interested in the conversation surrounding this, and I think the documentary did miss some things, some subjects and some talking points. I don't think that was necessarily the fault of Louis Theroux. I think it's just the subject is quite complex, and it's going to be quite difficult to speak about the complexity of the subject within, I think it was an hour and a half. And from the conversations I've been looking at post watching the documentary, I think they're also missing some of the complexity around this subject. So I just wanted to jump on and give my opinions on this. Hopefully they are opinions you haven't heard or that aren't being spoken about as much. And also shamelessly, I'm just jumping on to talk about this subject because it's very popular online at the moment, and I just want to jump on and maybe I'll get a wee bit more views than I usually get. So first, I wanted to just give my initial thoughts on the documentary. So I thought the documentary was very good. I was entertained by it. I was horrified by it. This was my exposure to this red pill community, if you will. I wasn't aware of anyone apart from Andrew Tate within the documentary. I wasn't really aware of these people. I was aware of the subject of the red pill community. I was aware of the abhorrent and misogynistic rhetoric that is sweeping the online community and is taking the interest of a lot of young boys and young men. But I wasn't aware of these specific individuals within the documentary, so it was quite eye-opening for me. I thought Louis Theroux did a really good job, as he usually does in his documentaries. I think one thing I noticed is, and one thing I've seen other people writing about the documentary is, in most of Louis Theroux's documentaries, he's speaking to people that I would say most liberal people would very much dislike, if not hate. But what Louis Theroux is very good at is allowing them space to open up, and we end up getting a deeper idea of who they are and why they hold the views that they do. We still end the documentary not liking these people, but at least we have a more rounded view of who they are, why they are the way that they are, and why they hold such views. With this documentary, I didn't feel like that was the case, but I do think the nature of the subjects, the nature of the fact that they're always streaming, they're very suspicious of mainstream media in the first place. So there is a limit to how open they're going to be and how deep they're going to go into their lives and why they hold the views that they do. So I don't necessarily think that's the fault of Louis Theroux. I think it's just a subject that he has chosen to make this documentary on are going to be very suspicious. They're filming him the whole time because they're suspicious of the way that the documentary is maybe going to be edited. They're just very suspicious of mainstream media in general. So I'm not sure that's Theroux's fault, but that is one of the things I did think initially after watching the documentary. One thing I've also seen, another criticism I saw, was that we didn't get much of a woman's standpoint, or the women within the documentary standpoint. They were asked questions, and their partners, their bosses in some circumstances, did shut them down and stop them from speaking, which was pretty hard to watch. And I do get the criticism that we weren't getting the women's standpoint as much. I understand from the documentary makers and Louis Theroux's standpoint that the subject is the manosphere, and so you've got an hour and a half to play with. The majority of the documentary is going to focus on the men within the manosphere and their views. I would say the criticism of there not being enough women's viewpoints is fair. I don't think that should have been in. I don't think. I'm trying to be very careful with my words here. I don't think that the hour and a half documentary could have shown more women's standpoints without. I think you're not going to make everyone happy, because like the men, if they focused on the women's standpoint in the hour and a half documentary, then the men would be unhappy, and and the fact that it's focused on the men within the manosphere, that some women are unhappy with it. I think maybe the solution to that is it could have been a two-parter. I think it could have been the documentary that they made, and another part could have been focused on the impact of these men and their rhetoric. So that could be looking at the 14 to 15-year-old boys that are consuming this content and believing this content, and the girls that are being subject to this rhetoric, whether that's from the consumers of the content, the 14 and the 15-year-old boys, or the OnlyFans models within the documentary itself. You could be speaking to the girlfriends of these men more, and in a separate, well, not separate, but like a two-part, a second part to the documentary surrounding the manosphere and the impact that it has. So yeah, I mean that's my initial views on the documentary itself. My views on the conversations surrounding the documentary, I should probably caveat everything I'm about to say with the kind of acknowledgement that the rhetoric of these men is abhorrent. The blatant anti-Semitism, sexism, and homophobia was horrific. Harrison Sullivan, at one point within the documentary, is saying something along the lines of, Louis Theroux is going to say that I'm homophobic and I'm racist and I'm sexist. I'm all of those things. And I think one of the things that really shocked me is just the openness about that he's willing to admit that. And I worry about the impact that has, that it's just very brazen and very open, rather than saying it's not misogynistic, it's this, even though they're saying something that's misogynistic. At the very least, they don't think that they are. But I mean, this guy actually has said that he is these things, and that's worrying. But yeah, back to the conversations surrounding it. So there's my acknowledgement that the things that these men are saying are abhorrent. They're horrific. The impact of the things that they're saying is horrific, and I think that's something that we should be extremely concerned about, and we should be focusing a lot of our attention around the impact that they're having and how to rectify that. And I'll also acknowledge here, before I go on, that the experiences of the women within the documentary, within the women that are impacted by this sort of extreme manosphere rhetoric, is also horrific. And yeah, I want to acknowledge that before I go in anyway. But one thing that I'm not seeing in the conversation is an acknowledgement of the complexity of the issue. And that is understandable, because the issue is so emotionally charged and horrific and offensive, a lot of the conversations are going to be very extreme, and that is very fair. But when the conversation goes to the extremes, they become very simple, and this isn't a simple subject. So on the one extreme, you've got these men who are saying horrific misogynistic things, hold these horrific misogynistic, sexist, homophobic, fill in the blank views. That's the obvious. Like, they have these extreme views, and these views are immature, unintellectual, offensive, and in a sense simple. And even if you just boil down the rhetoric that they have towards women, these guys, like HS Tiki Toki, or whatever his silly name is, he's in Marbella in the documentary. You've got the guy that has the Fit and Fresh podcast. I'll just look it up. Myron Gaines, you've got him. He lives in Miami, and both these places, this is where a lot of people who are, let's say, social media conscious go. It's where people who consume a hell of a lot of social media and who will judge their lives based on the people they're seeing on social media. So it's people who see people like HS Tiki Toki with his cars in his big house, and they'll maybe think, oh, that's what I want. I want all that money, and I want that. And so, with that being said, a lot of the women that he'll come into contact with, that seems to be what he's basing all of his still horrific views on. And so when they're saying that women, I don't know if they're saying women are stupid or women are, I don't know. I can't really remember a lot of the horrific views because they're just so horrific, and I don't really want to relay them. But they're basing that off the women that they've encountered in their lives, and that's not to say that that's these women's faults for this misogynistic content. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not blaming these women at all. I'm just saying that they're basing their opinions on this demographic, and especially like Myron Gaines deliberately in his podcast brings on social media influencers and content creators, women, to basically to in some cases harass, offend, in a lot of cases bully. And these women seem to be willing to go on this podcast because it's maybe a two-way thing where, like, Myron Gaines gets more views when he does these sorts of podcasts, and these women get more views or subscribers or followers wherever they're posting. But if he got let's say a woman that's not a social media influencer, and he got someone, a female intellectual, his whole worldview just collapses. And I don't know if he's dumb enough, if he's that stupid to not know that that's the case, or he's stupid, or he knows that that's the case, and he's deliberately getting a specific demographic onto his podcast to prove his horrific misogynistic views. But that's how that kind of view is very, very simple. It's very immature. It's very unintellectual, and I just want to be like, I don't want this to sound like I'm blaming women for these views. I'm definitely not doing that. I'm just saying that from these guys' standpoints, they're coming at this from an extremely simplified, immature, and misogynistic viewpoint, and part of that is because of the demographic of women that they interact with. I mean, HS Tiki Toki, whatever it is, I mean, the majority of the women that he interacts with are OnlyFans models, and so he either seems to be basing his opinions on that, or he's deliberately doing that, even with the knowledge that that's far from the majority of women. So I don't know. Like, I don't know which one's worse. I think one of the things that trouble me about this Harrison Sullivan is that the immorality of the guy, the fact that he knows that what he's doing is immoral and he knows the impact that he's having, and he doesn't care because it makes him money and it gives him more fame. That's more the worrying thing. It would be a different story if he thought, I mean, it wouldn't be that much of a different story, but it would be different if he genuinely believed that what he was doing was moral and right and justified. And it is, and when it isn't, but at least if he thinks it is, then he believes he's doing the right thing. But he doesn't even think that, and that is worse. Their views on men as well is extremely immature, simplified, and unintellectual, because they're basing their views on men on the small demographic of men that they've come into contact with, and I'm guessing that the majority of the men that they come into contact with are very, very similar, and very, very similar to who they've become. You only have to look at, and I'll get into this more later, but you only have to look at these guys' upbringing to see what their views of men is. I mean, there's a quote in the documentary where Andrew Tate's talking about his upbringing and says something like, that first whipping, that you have to grow up fast when that happens. And he's talking about himself as a child. And so perhaps his first view of what a man is a man beating the crap out of him. So that's how that extreme is extremely simplified in their viewpoints. On the other extreme, and this is the extreme where I really want to be careful with what I say, but I know that what I'm going to say people are not going to like. But on the other extreme is people who believe that this is all men, or even the majority of men who hold these views, and that men, say, of my age and older are susceptible to this content. And granted, there'll be perhaps a significant amount of men that are 30 and older who fall prey to this sort of content. But I don't think that's the majority. And I think the more worrying thing, and I think the thing that's not actually been discussed, and this is what I mean when they're making a very simplified view, when they're saying that this is worrying because men will hold these views, they're generalizing it to be that the majority of men will watch this content and believe it, or take it on, or act in accordance with it. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think as well, people on like kind of this extreme will also simplify the manosphere to be and I suppose it's maybe worth defining the manosphere in the first place. I'm going to see what online says. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to take that as true, but the Manosphere is a collection of websites, blogs, and online forums promoting masculinity, misogyny, and strong opposition to feminism. It encompasses various, sometimes conflicting groups, including men's rights activists, incels, MGTOW, whatever that is, and pickup artists, all generally united by the belief that society is biased against men. See, the problem, this is part of the problem I kind of have with this, is that a lot of this is generalized, and people will end up thinking that anyone that's talking about men's issues are like these guys that are in the documentary, and they're misogynistic, and they kind of play a sort of exclusive game where they say, if you're going to talk about men's issues, then that means that you are against women's issues, or you think men have it worse than women, or something along those lines. And it's true, even if you look at this definition, it's groups including men's rights activists. I've spoken, and I see a lot of men's rights activists online, and they're not misogynistic. They're not against feminism. They're not incels. They're not pickup artists, and they're nothing like. I don't think they're nothing like these guys. They're men who see that men are struggling, and men and women. Women. There are women men's rights activists who are women, who see that men are struggling and want to discuss solutions to it. And I don't know if that should be lumped in with people like Harris and Sullivan. So this is what I mean when I say, like, both extremes kind of simplify the issue. And I've said it before, I think it's Annie Duke that said it, is the answer, I think she's talking about politics, but it applies here. The answer usually lies between the two extremes. I've definitely, that's not the direct quote, but, and I think it's true here. I think this issue of misogyny and the horrific content that's being put out by these people that we saw in the documentary, I think it's a very complex issue, and I don't think it's as simple as these two extremes make it out to be. That these guys are saying that it's the women's fault, and it's fucking everyone's against men, and you have to dominate women, and that's what they want. Obviously, that's not the answer. And on the other side, it's people saying that this is all men, or this is men's issues to solve. I think that's one thing that I find quite striking in a lot of the conversations surrounding men's and women's issues, is that when discussing women's issues, the conversation usually surrounds the fact that women's issues are systemic, and when talking about men's issues, the conversation usually centers around the fact that it's some form of men's fault, and so it's up to men to solve it. Men need to cry more, men need to show emotion more, men need to do this and that and blah blah blah. And a lot of the issues that men face are, sorry to say, systemic and cultural, and the responsibility does not solely lie with men. And I understand that with this Manosphere documentary, the responsibility does lie with these abhorrent men, and I completely understand that and sympathize with that, and I agree that the impact that they're having as individuals and as a group is horrific and must be discussed. But the thing that I don't see discussed is, or as much, is what made them the way that they are. Who's responsible? What's responsible? They're clearly the product of society and culture. You see, like social media, YouTube, everything like that, those algorithms promote extreme, shocking, and offensive content more than they promote thought out, sensitive content. So that's one. Parents, and I hate saying this, especially as a non-parent, and I'm not demeaning how hard it is to be a parent and how hard it is to, and I certainly worry about being a parent in this time of social media and AI and all this sort of thing. But parents need to hold some form of responsibility in that they need to know that just because your child is in their room, that means that they're safe. They're definitely at risk if they're allowed free access to the online world. And these guys should show you that. You shouldn't want your children to be exposed to these horrific, abhorrent men. And so there needs to be some form of solution that I don't know if it's what Australia have done, where they've banned social media to anyone under 16. 16, yep. I don't know. I think I agree with that. I think that's maybe what should happen here. I don't think like our brains aren't fully formed until we're 25, and so what chance does a 15-year-old have when they're viewing this content to critically think about it and critically think whether it's correct? They're going to see this guy has a Lamborghini and lots of money and an attractive girlfriend, and he seems really happy, so that's what I want to be. And then if you add in the misogynistic and the homophobic and the anti-Semitic content, they're going to take that on as well as a full package. And so that's something. Schools is another thing. Like, what are schools doing to prevent this from getting worse? I think something in the conversation I'm not seeing is the future, because one point that Louis Theroux pointed out to Harrison Sullivan is that his demographic is like about 15 to 16-year-old boys. Harrison Sullivan denied this, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. It's not like I'm not his demographic. If you look on, I haven't been exposed to these guys on my algorithm. They're not. I'm not seeing them. So, and I know I'm just one person, but I would hazard a guess and say that 13-year-old males are not really being shown this content as much as 15, 16-year-old boys. And so, what you're going to lay your responsibility on them? Like they're children. So I think part of the discussion really should be about what the impact these guys are having on these boys and what that's going to do to society in the future. Are we going to have more Harrison Sullivans and Sneakos because they're consuming their content when they're 15, and so they're going to want to be YouTube influencers when they grow up, and they're going to, you know, repeat this sort of rhetoric? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not seeing a lot of that in the conversation. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not extremely well researched in this subject, so I'm maybe wrong that subject isn't being spoken about enough. But I think, yeah, the conversation surrounding responsibility for this for these issues isn't spoken about enough, and it's far more complex than people are making it out. People are really simplifying this issue, and I think that also just shows like where society is and what we want as humans. Because for the as long as humans have been around, we've always looked for like very simple stories to complex issues. To me, that's what religion is. Religion is the simplification of something that's very complex. How the world came to be, and what our meaning is in the world, and who we are as humans. Religion tends to very much simplify those issues down to stories, and I'm not denying the significance that religion, the positive and negative significance that religion has had on humans, but that is to me what religion is, and we're not going to stop doing that the more secular we become, and this is an example of that. These men are simplifying very complex issues down to these binaries of like something they say in the documentary, the two men that Louis Theroux talks to, is that men aren't born with value and women are. That was hard. It's hard to hear. I've been reading Matt Haig's Comfort book, and he has something in there about that you are inherently valuable. You would say that a baby holds value, and that it doesn't have to prove itself. It's a baby, and so why is it any different when we grow up? We have inherent value as we are, and it hurts when people say stuff like that men, that we don't hold any value when we're born simply because we're men. It's just not true. Yeah, these men are just like very much simplifying a very complex issue of like how society is run and how men are viewed. They're very much simplifying it, and this is why they're very much prone to conspiracy theories, because again, conspiracy theories are simplifying complex issues. These men are clearly looking for answers, and they think that the answer is this sort of matrix red pill thing that you then see the world for what it is. And like the majority of what they're talking about when you see the world for what it is just very simplified, in that the government's against you and things like that. I think also when we're talking about responsibility, I think as much as the progress that we've made with regards to women's rights and women's issues is amazing, I think the unintended consequence is coming to the surface now if we continually ignore the issues of young boys and men. And again, I feel like these conversations always come back to kind of exclusivity, in that if we're going to discuss men's issues, and that means we're ignoring women's issues. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just find that a lot of I think a lot that's missing in the conversation is, what can we do to rectify this for young boys and men? What can we do for them? How can we better help them? I mean, in the West, you're seeing less men in higher education. Men are overrepresented in suicide stats and drug addiction stats, prison overpopulation, death in wars, death in the workplace. And again, this isn't to deny the issues of women. It's just I don't think the conversation is helping young boys and men. And that's not to say that it's our fault on, say, if we're left on the left or we're liberals. It's not to say that this is liberals' faults for the rhetoric of HS Tiki Toki and Sneeko and everyone else that was in that Louis Theroux documentary. I'm not saying that, but I think we do bear some responsibility for the young boys who are consuming this content and for not intervening. And I worry that by not intervening, we're allowing these young boys and men to fall prey to this sort of rhetoric. I think we also hold responsibility, and I think this is where it becomes very complex, because the responsibility lies with many. It's not just these horrific, abhorrent men in the documentary. The responsibility does lie with us as well, to a certain extent. So I don't. It's just something to think about. I don't know. I don't know if anything I've said there is of value. Hopefully it is. Like I said, this is just very spontaneous. I'm just jumping on just to give my initial thoughts. I'm sure I've missed some issue. I've missed someone's issue. I'm sure I've not acknowledged certain issues enough or anything like that. But I mean, the nature of this issue is it is controversial, and yeah, I'm sure people won't like what I've said. But I think it's important to discuss these things in a fair, balanced way. I hope I've done that, and I hope I've given people something to think about, and perhaps deepened the conversation around these issues. I hope I've done that. That was my initial intention with recording this. So, thank you. If you've made it this far, wow, thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching and listening, and let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. Do you agree with what I've said? Do you disagree with what I've said? Let me know. I'd be very interested to read them, but just because this topic really interests me, and I think it's an important one as well. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned, because tomorrow I'll be dropping another episode, the actual scheduled one that I was always going to be dropping tomorrow, with John McCleary, who was on Dragon's Den very recently. So we'll be discussing that and various self-development and entrepreneurial tactics and strategies. So stay tuned for that. See you soon.